Before we begin, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. If you enjoy real stories about forgotten ideas, practical wisdom, and people who solve problems in unexpected ways, you're in the right place. Take a moment to like the video. It helps more people discover these stories. And if you find this one interesting, consider sharing it with someone who appreciates history, engineering, or survival knowledge. Now let's begin. Winter came early to the northern reaches of Maine that year, arriving not with ceremony but with quiet finality. By the second week of November, the dirt roads that connected the scattered logging clearings to the nearest town had hardened into rutted ribbons of ice. The rivers slowed, their surfaces dulled by thin skins of gray frost that thickened with every passing night. Snow did not fall all at once. It came in patient intervals, light at first, then heavier, until the land seemed to retreat beneath it, surrendering fields, stumps, and fence lines to a uniform white silence. By the time the first true storms arrived, the region was already closed in on itself, a place apart from the rest of the country, governed by its own harsher rules. The settlement itself was little more than a loose gathering of families spread across several miles of forest. There was no formal town center, only a general store near the river crossing, a small schoolhouse used when weather allowed, and a handful of workshops where tools were repaired and timber was shaped for the long months ahead. Life here was not built on comfort, but on endurance. Every household measured its security in cords of firewood stacked beside the house or under crude lean-tos. Every decision made in autumn was judged later, in winter, by whether it reduced the number of trips to the woodpile in sub-zero winds. Homes were built quickly and practically. Squared logs or rough-sawn boards formed walls meant to hold heat by sheer thickness. Gaps were filled with moss, clay, or whatever else could be pressed into place before the first hard freeze. Roofs were steep to shed snow, foundations shallow but wide, resting on stone to keep the living space just far enough above the frozen ground. The idea was always the same: build solid, build tight, and fight the cold directly. Anything else was considered unnecessary, even reckless. It was into this environment that Edward Caldwell had settled 2 years earlier, arriving with little more than his tools, a modest savings, and habits shaped far from the forests of Maine. He had spent most of his working life on the Atlantic coast, where the concerns of builders were different. There, salt air crept into everything, moisture worked its way into joints, and structures failed not from cold, but from rot. On the docks and in the shipyards, Caldwell had learned to respect forces that were invisible until damage was already done. He had seen hulls split from trapped dampness, and strong timbers softened into uselessness by neglect. The lesson stayed with him long after he left the sea behind. His land lay slightly apart from the others, on a rise where the trees thinned just enough to allow winter winds to sweep across unhindered. From that vantage point, he could see the smoke of neighboring cabins rising straight up on calm days, or bending sharply when storms pressed through. He watched closely during his first winter, not with fear but with attention. He noted how quickly snow accumulated against walls, how meltwater refroze along foundations, how firewood left exposed under tarps grew heavier week by week as it absorbed moisture from the air. He noticed, too, how much wood was burned simply to maintain a temperature that could be endured rather than enjoyed. The winter tested everyone. By January, isolation was complete. Supplies brought in during autumn became precious. Men rose before dawn to feed stoves, their breath fogging the air inside their own homes. Children slept close together under thick blankets. The rhythm of daily life narrowed to the essential tasks of keeping warm and keeping fed. When storms passed, people emerged briefly to clear paths, check on animals, and restack fallen wood, only to retreat again as dusk arrived early and the cold reclaimed the land. Caldwell's own house was unremarkable in appearance. It was small, sturdy, and built with care, but it followed the same general pattern as the others. From the outside, there was nothing to suggest that it would become the center of quiet attention in the months ahead. Yet even as his neighbors focused on sealing cracks and adding insulation where they could, Caldwell found himself troubled by a different concern. The problem, as he saw it, was not simply how much heat a house could hold, but how much moisture it allowed to reach its structure and its fuel. Cold, he understood, was manageable. Dampness was not. As the first winter deepened, he kept notes in a small ledger, recording temperatures, snowfall, and the condition of his firewood. He weighed pieces when he brought them inside, then again after they had sat near the stove. The difference was never small. Even wood cut and seasoned the previous year arrived at the hearth carrying water within it, water that had to be driven out by heat before the wood could burn properly. That heat came at a cost, paid for with more wood, more labor, and more smoke filling the living space. By the time spring finally loosened winter's grip, Caldwell had reached a quiet conclusion. The methods everyone relied upon were not wrong, so much as incomplete. They addressed cold directly while leaving other forces free to do their damage. When the snow melted and the ground softened, he walked the perimeter of his house, examining the lower logs and the foundation stones. He found early signs of moisture where meltwater had splashed and refrozen. Nothing alarming yet, but enough to confirm his suspicions. Summer passed quickly in the north. There was always more work than time allowed, and Caldwell spent most of it preparing. He repaired tools, cut timber, and sketched rough plans that he adjusted again and again. He did not speak much about what he intended to do. In a place where resources were carefully counted, unusual ideas were rarely welcome. He understood that what he was considering would appear excessive at best, foolish at worst. When autumn returned, it did so with an urgency that left little room for doubt. The air sharpened early, frost appearing on the ground before the leaves had fully fallen. Nights grew longer, and the forest took on the brittle stillness that preceded snow. Caldwell looked at his house, at the stacks of wood he had cut, and at the open land surrounding them. He knew that once winter arrived again, there would be no opportunity to change course. The first snow fell before Thanksgiving, light but persistent, settling into the grass and clinging to branches. It was then that Caldwell began to act. While others focused on their usual preparations, he started marking the ground around his home, pacing distances and setting stakes. The measurements were deliberate, leaving space where none was expected, outlining a structure that did not yet exist in the minds of those who passed by. As December approached and the cold tightened its hold, the outlines on Caldwell's land hinted at something unusual. They suggested not an addition or an outbuilding, but something larger, something that would encompass rather than extend. Few paid much attention at first. Winter demanded concentration, and most assumed he was preparing another shed or storage space like any other. But the season was closing in, and the isolation of the settlement was nearly complete once more. The same forces that had tested the community the year before were gathering again, indifferent and relentless. Unseen beneath the snow, Caldwell's preparations waited, poised at the edge of action. The winter that had taught him what others had missed was returning, and with it, the opportunity to test an idea shaped by observation rather than tradition. By the time December settled fully over the northern woods, Edward Caldwell's intentions could no longer be mistaken for ordinary preparation. The snow had begun to accumulate in earnest, layering itself over the frozen ground and dulling the sharp edges of the landscape. Yet Caldwell worked steadily, as if guided by a schedule that existed independently of the season. Where others hurried to finish last repairs and then withdrew indoors, he remained outside, measuring, lifting, setting posts into ground that resisted every blow of the shovel. The structure began with vertical timbers placed at deliberate distances from the walls of his house. They stood several feet away on all sides, not touching, not braced against the original building, but surrounding it like the perimeter of a much larger form. Each post was sunk deep enough to hold firm against frost heave and winter winds, aligned carefully so that the geometry remained true despite the uneven terrain. From a distance, the layout resembled the early stages of a barn or a storage shed, though its placement puzzled those who noticed it. There was no clear purpose in building so close to the house without actually connecting to it. As horizontal beams followed and the skeleton of the structure rose, the confusion only deepened. Caldwell was not expanding his living space. He was enclosing it. The growing frame wrapped around the existing house with a consistency that left no doubt it was intentional. The distance between the inner walls and the outer posts was uniform, wide enough for a person to walk through comfortably, wide enough to stack supplies, wide enough to suggest that the empty space itself was meant to serve a purpose. Neighbors passing along the snow-packed track slowed their steps to watch. In a settlement where most construction followed familiar patterns, this was something new, and novelty invited judgment. Some assumed Caldwell had miscalculated and would soon realize his mistake. Others believed he was building a large shed for equipment and had simply chosen an awkward placement. As days passed and the outer walls began to take shape, neither explanation held. Boards went up, nailed horizontally with small gaps left intentionally between them. The walls did not meet the ground directly but stopped just short, leaving a narrow opening along the base. Above, the roofline extended outward well beyond the footprint of the inner house, forming deep overhangs that cast long shadows even in the weak winter light. Snow that fell against the outer walls slid harmlessly away or drifted at a distance, piling where it posed no threat to the structure inside. The reaction from the community shifted from curiosity to open skepticism. In a place where every plank represented hours of labor and transport, the sight of so much lumber being used without an obvious benefit unsettled people. Caldwell was effectively building a wooden hangar around his home, a shell that did not add rooms, windows, or visible comfort. It was not insulated in the way people understood insulation. The boards were not packed tight. The air moved freely through it. To many, it looked like the worst of both worlds, too open to keep heat in, too large to justify its cost. Men who had built cabins across the region shook their heads as they passed. They knew how heat behaved, or at least how they believed it did. A wall, in their understanding, either stopped cold or it did not. Adding another wall, especially one separated by open space, seemed only to give heat more surfaces through which to escape. The idea that air itself could serve as a barrier, that space could be useful rather than wasteful, ran counter to generations of habit. Caldwell worked without haste and without visible concern for the opinions forming around him. He rose early, finished tasks methodically, and adjusted his plans as conditions required. When the cold grew severe enough to stiffen his fingers, he paused only long enough to warm them before continuing. Each element of the construction followed the same logic, though that logic remained invisible to those watching from the outside. As the outer walls closed in, the scale of the project became undeniable. The hangar stood taller than the original house, its roofline broad and protective. From certain angles, the inner dwelling all but disappeared, reduced to a dark mass within a larger wooden envelope. Smoke from the chimney rose through an opening Caldwell had carefully framed, allowing it to vent freely without transferring heat or moisture to the surrounding structure. The community's response hardened. What had begun as puzzled observation turned into quiet ridicule. Caldwell's project was discussed in the general store, mentioned in passing during shared work days, and weighed against the unspoken standard of practicality that governed frontier life. Some believed he would regret the effort once winter deepened. Others were convinced the structure would collapse under snow load or channel cold air directly against his house, making matters worse rather than better. Yet even as judgment spread, Caldwell's actions suggested careful forethought rather than improvisation. He did not simply enclose the space and leave it empty. Once the outer shell stood complete enough to block wind and precipitation, he began using the area between the two buildings with purpose. Firewood was carried in and stacked neatly along the inner perimeter of the hangar. Each piece was placed upright, arranged to allow air to pass freely around it. Tools and equipment that would normally be stored outside were moved into the protected space. Nothing was piled haphazardly. Everything followed an order that reflected long familiarity with working systems rather than temporary solutions. The hangar was not sealed, but it was controlled. Snow could not reach the wood, rain could not soak it, and yet moisture had a way to escape. The air inside the structure moved gently, driven by differences in temperature and pressure that Caldwell understood instinctively, if not formally. The space was neither indoors nor outdoors in the usual sense. It existed somewhere between, a buffer zone that absorbed the harshness of the environment before it could reach the house itself. As the days shortened and the sun traced lower arcs across the sky, the construction reached its conclusion. The last boards were fixed in place, the roof secured, and the ground inside cleared of debris. From the outside, the result still appeared strange. A house hidden within a larger wooden building defied conventional explanation. There was no ornamentation, no attempt to justify the effort through appearance. It was a functional form stripped of anything that might make it easily understood. When the first serious storm of the season swept through, bringing heavy snow and sharp winds, Caldwell's hangar stood firm. Drifts formed against its outer walls, but the inner house remained untouched. The space between absorbed the cold, slowing its advance. Inside that space, the stacked wood began to change subtly. It lightened as moisture left it, becoming more responsive to touch, more ready to burn. Neighbors noticed small details even if they did not yet grasp their significance. Caldwell no longer had to dig paths through deep snow to reach his firewood. He moved calmly through the sheltered space, selecting pieces without hurry. Smoke from his chimney appeared thinner, steadier. Still, these observations were easy to dismiss as coincidence or imagination. Winter pressed in fully now, sealing the settlement once more. The hangar around Caldwell's house stood as a quiet anomaly against the white landscape, a structure that seemed to challenge accepted wisdom without ever stating its case outright. Whatever its purpose, it would soon be tested. The same forces that had shaped life in the North for generations were gathering strength again, and they would reveal whether this unusual construction was folly or foresight. Once the wooden hangar stood complete, its presence altered the small landscape around Caldwell's home in ways that were subtle at first and easy to overlook. From a distance, it remained an oddity, a large, plain structure whose purpose seemed ambiguous at best. Yet up close, the space between the outer shell and the inner house began to reveal a quiet order that reflected deliberate thinking rather than excess. This was not an abandoned gap or a byproduct of miscalculation. It was the core of the idea itself. Caldwell moved through that space daily, not as someone inspecting a finished project with pride, but as someone continuing a process. He observed how the air behaved there, how it flowed gently even on calm days, and more actively when the wind rose outside. The hangar's walls did not stop the air entirely. They moderated it. Gusts that struck the exterior were broken, slowed, and diffused before they could reach the inner house. What arrived at the cabin walls was no longer a force, but a presence. Cooler than the interior, yet far less aggressive than the open winter beyond. Moisture, more than cold, was what Caldwell watched most carefully. Snow piled against the outer boards during storms, sometimes rising halfway up the walls, but it never pressed directly against the house itself. When temperatures rose briefly and the snow softened, meltwater drained away harmlessly outside the hangar. Inside, the ground remained comparatively dry. There were no cycles of wetting and freezing against the cabin logs, no creeping dampness seeping into joints and seams. The inner structure existed in a state of relative stability, shielded from the constant assault of changing conditions. The firewood stored in this intermediate space became the clearest demonstration of the hangar's purpose. Caldwell stacked it methodically, standing each split piece upright, arranging rows so that air could pass freely between them. Bark faced outward where possible, while the cut faces remained exposed to the circulating air. Unlike the wood piles outside other homes, these stacks never collected snow or ice. Frost did not cling to them overnight. They remained accessible in all weather, their surfaces dry enough to leave no moisture on the hand. Day by day, the wood changed. It grew lighter, its surface texture sharpening as residual moisture escaped. Caldwell had known this would happen, but seeing it confirmed his reasoning. Even in winter, wood could dry if protected from direct exposure while still allowed to breathe. The hangar created exactly those conditions. It was neither sealed nor open, neither warm nor cold in the conventional sense. It was controlled. Inside the house, the effects were equally noticeable, though less visible. The air felt steadier. Temperatures fluctuated more slowly, responding to changes outside with a delay that made them easier to manage. When Caldwell fed the stove, the heat lingered longer, absorbed by the walls and furnishings and released gradually. The house no longer lost warmth as abruptly as it had the previous winter. The cold had farther to travel, and it arrived weakened. Caldwell did not explain any of this to his neighbors, not because he guarded the idea, but because he understood that explanations without evidence carried little weight. The logic behind the hangar was not easily summarized in a sentence or two. It relied on principles most people encountered only indirectly, through trial and error, rather than deliberate design. To many, heat was something to trap, moisture something to tolerate. The idea of managing both through space itself required a shift in perspective. As winter deepened, The contrast between Caldwell's preparations and those of the surrounding homes became more pronounced. Others continued their familiar routines, hauling wood through snow, knocking ice from logs before bringing them inside, feeding stoves more frequently as temperatures dropped. Smoke thickened in the settlement during cold mornings, hanging low and heavy before dispersing. Chimneys accumulated soot and residue from damp fuel, increasing the risk of fires and further reducing efficiency. At Caldwell's place, the routine changed subtly. He needed fewer trips to restock wood. The stove burned cleaner, its fire more responsive. Ashes accumulated more slowly. None of this was dramatic enough to provoke immediate reconsideration among the community, but it formed a pattern that would become impossible to ignore once tested by more severe conditions. The hangar also proved useful in ways that extended beyond heating. Tools stored within the protected space did not rust as quickly. Leather goods remained supple instead of stiffening from repeated freezing and thawing. Grain sacks showed no signs of dampness. The space functioned as a workshop when weather outside made open-air labor impractical. Caldwell repaired equipment there, sheltered from wind and snow, his breath visible but his hands steady. All of this stemmed from the same underlying principle: separating the living environment from direct exposure to the elements without sealing it off entirely. The hangar acted as a mediator, absorbing extremes and releasing them gradually. It reduced the speed at which cold, moisture, and wind could reach the house, transforming violent fluctuations into manageable changes. Those who passed by continued to judge the structure by its appearance alone. They saw extra lumber, extra effort, and an absence of obvious gain. What they did not see was the invisible work being done by air and dryness, by the slow movement of heat and the quiet escape of moisture. These processes left no immediate mark, no dramatic display. They worked patiently, accumulating advantage over time. By midwinter, the settlement settled into its familiar pattern of endurance. Snow lay deep and unbroken between storms. The forest creaked and shifted under the weight of ice. Nights stretched long, and days offered little more than a pale arc of light. It was the season when weaknesses revealed themselves, when small inefficiencies became serious problems. The logic embedded in Caldwell's construction waited for such a moment. It did not announce itself or demand attention. It simply existed, prepared to be measured against forces that cared nothing for tradition or opinion. What had begun as an unusual construction now stood as a quiet experiment, its results accumulating invisibly with each passing day. The hangar did not promise comfort, it promised consistency. And in a land shaped by winter, consistency was often the difference between strain and survival. The storm announced itself without drama, as the most dangerous storms often do. There was no sudden darkness, no immediate violence in the air. Instead, the wind that had moved steadily through the trees for days slowed and then fell away almost entirely. The forest stood unnaturally still, branches frozen in place, as though the land itself were holding its breath. The sky took on a pale, washed appearance that seasoned residents recognized with unease. It was the kind of quiet that preceded hardship. By the following morning, the temperature had dropped sharply. Cold settled into the ground with a density that felt heavier than usual, pressing down rather than simply surrounding. Snow began to fall shortly after dawn, not drifting gently but moving sideways, driven by a wind that returned suddenly and without warning. What had been stillness became motion everywhere at once. The storm did not build gradually, it arrived fully formed. Within hours, visibility collapsed. Snow filled the air so completely that distances shrank to a few yards. Wind tore across the open ground and funneled through gaps in the forest, piling drifts against buildings, fences, and anything else that interrupted its path. Sound changed too. The world became a constant roar, punctuated by sharp impacts as ice and debris struck exposed surfaces. Travel became impossible. Even stepping outside required effort and intention, each movement contested by the force of the wind. Across the settlement, families retreated into their homes and began the work they knew too well. Stoves were fed constantly, doors sealed as best they could be, windows covered with extra layers where available. Firewood disappeared rapidly from stacks that had seemed sufficient only days earlier. Each trip outside to retrieve more fuel was an ordeal, snow clawing at faces and clothing, wind-numbing fingers within minutes. Wood brought inside was often coated in ice, its surfaces slick and unyielding. As the storm intensified, the weaknesses of traditional preparations revealed themselves quickly. Wood stored outdoors absorbed moisture almost immediately. Snow driven beneath tarps melted and refroze, binding pieces together. When such wood reached the stove, it hissed and steamed, releasing clouds of smoke that filled rooms already starved for fresh air. Fires burned unevenly, flaring briefly before collapsing into smoldering frustration. Heat escaped faster than it could be produced, drawn out through walls and gaps by the relentless cold pressing from all sides. Cabin interiors grew dim and oppressive. The air thickened with smoke and the smell of damp wood. Families layered clothing even indoors, breath visible as they spoke or moved. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by the need to tend fires before they died entirely. The effort required simply to maintain survivable conditions consumed all attention. There was no margin for error, no reserve of comfort to draw upon. Caldwell's home faced the same storm, but it did not face it directly. The wooden hangar absorbed the first impact. Wind struck its broad sides and was broken apart, losing coherence as it passed through gaps and around corners. Snow piled against the outer walls, rising steadily, yet it never touched the house itself. Inside the hangar, the air moved, but it moved gently, stripped of its violence. The space between shell and home became a zone of diminished force, where the storm's energy was spent before reaching what lay within. Caldwell moved through that space without urgency. Retrieving firewood required no excavation, no struggle against drifts. The stacks stood where he had left them, dry and accessible. The pieces he carried inside felt light in his hands, their surfaces clean, their interiors ready to burn. When placed in the stove, they ignited quickly and burned with steady intensity, producing heat rather than smoke. The fire responded predictably, allowing him to regulate it with small adjustments, rather than constant attention. Inside the house, the difference was unmistakable. The temperature rose and held. Walls that had once grown cold to the touch remained neutral, even faintly warm. Heat released by the stove lingered, absorbed and returned slowly, smoothing out the fluctuations that plagued other homes. Caldwell fed the fire at longer intervals, conserving fuel without sacrificing comfort. The storm raged outside, but its presence inside was muted, reduced to sound rather than sensation. As the hours stretched into days, the storm showed no sign of relenting. Snow continued to drive across the land, reshaping it into unfamiliar forms. Drifts climbed higher, bearing markers and pathways. Trees bent under the weight of ice, some breaking and falling with sharp cracks that echoed through the white void. The settlement remained cut off, each household confined to its own small island of endurance. In other homes, the strain deepened. Firewood supplies dwindled at alarming rates. The effort required to keep stoves burning grew exhausting, and the quality of the fires declined as fuel worsened. Smoke irritation became a constant problem, stinging eyes and throats. The cold crept in despite every effort, settling into corners and floors, sapping energy and morale. The storm was no longer simply weather, it was an adversary wearing people down through attrition. Caldwell observed these conditions indirectly, through the sounds carried on the wind and the occasional glimpse of movement when the storm paused briefly between surges. He did not venture far. There was no need. His preparations had been made with exactly this kind of event in mind. The hangar continued to perform its quiet work, buffering the house from extremes, protecting supplies, and maintaining a stable interior environment while chaos reigned outside. On the second day, during a short lull when the wind dropped enough to allow limited movement, evidence of the contrast became visible. Smoke from Caldwell's chimney rose steadily, thin and pale, indicating efficient combustion. Nearby chimneys belched darker plumes that flattened quickly in the wind, betraying damp fuel and incomplete burns. Snow piled high against the outer shell of the hangar, but inside that shell, the inner house remained untouched, dry, and unchanged. The storm persisted into a third day. By then, exhaustion weighed heavily across the settlement. People measured time by stove feedings and the slow passage of light across frosted windows. In Caldwell's house, life continued with relative normalcy. Meals were prepared without haste. Movement was unencumbered by layers of clothing. The cold existed as a fact outside the hangar, acknowledged but not fought directly. When the storm finally began to weaken, it did so gradually, the wind easing and the snowfall thinning until the world emerged, reshaped and subdued. The silence that followed was different from the stillness that had preceded the storm. It carried the weight of what had passed, a pause for reckoning. Paths would need to be cleared, damage assessed, losses counted. Caldwell stepped into the hangar and then beyond it, surveying the altered landscape. The hangar had done exactly what it was meant to do. It bore the marks of the storm on its outer face, snow packed high against its walls, ice clinging to its boards. Inside, the house stood as it had before, unchanged and ready to continue. The trial had come, and the logic embedded in the unusual construction had met it without spectacle or strain. The storm left the settlement altered in ways that went beyond the reshaped drifts and broken branches. When the wind finally loosened its grip and the sky cleared into a pale, brittle blue, people emerged cautiously from their homes, stepping into a world that felt both familiar and strangely diminished. Snow lay piled high against walls and fences, sculpted into hard, wind-carved forms that resisted shovels and boots alike. Paths had vanished. Landmarks were buried. The effort of simply moving from one place to another required planning and strength. Attention turned immediately to necessities. Roofs were checked for damage. Animals were accounted for. Firewood stacks were inspected with growing concern. What many found was discouraging. Wood that had been carefully cut and stacked in autumn now sat locked together in frozen masses, coated in ice and heavy with absorbed moisture. Tarps had torn or shifted under the force of the wind, allowing snow to work its way deep into the piles. Pieces pulled free felt dense and cold, reluctant to burn. Supplies that had seemed adequate before the storm now looked uncertain. Inside many homes, the evidence of the past days lingered. Soot darkened hearthstones. Chimney residue flaked away in brittle sheets. The air smelled stale, carrying traces of smoke that clung to fabric and hair. Walls near the floor showed dampness where melting snow had refrozen repeatedly against the logs. In corners and along foundations, ice had formed and melted in cycles that left behind darkened wood and softening seams. These were not immediate failures, but they were warnings, signs of stress accumulating quietly beneath the surface. Caldwell walked through the settlement in the days that followed, helping where he could, lending tools and effort without comment. He noticed what others were only beginning to recognize. The storm had not merely tested endurance, it had exposed structural habits. Homes built to fight cold directly had been forced into a constant struggle, burning fuel at unsustainable rates while still allowing moisture to infiltrate. The cost was not only in wood consumed, but in damage begun. When he returned to his own property, the contrast was stark. Snow lay deep against the outer walls of the hangar, but it had already begun to settle and harden, its presence confined to the exterior. Inside, the space between the shell and the house remained clear. The ground was dry. The stacks of firewood stood exactly as they had before the storm, unchanged except for having dried further. Tools stored there showed no rust, no swelling of handles, no stiffness from repeated freezing. The inner house itself bore almost no trace of what had passed. The logs were dry to the touch. The foundation stones were free of ice buildup. The air inside smelled clean. Word spread quietly, not through declaration, but through observation. People noticed that Caldwell was not repairing damage. He was not replacing soaked supplies. He was not hauling in emergency fuel from distant sources. His routine had returned to normal almost immediately, while others remained locked in recovery. This difference invited attention where ridicule had failed. Calculations began, first privately, then more openly. Families counted how much wood they had burned during the storm and compared it to what remained. The numbers were unsettling. In some cases, nearly half of a winter's supply had vanished in a matter of days. When estimates were extended forward, the conclusion was unavoidable. Many would run short before spring unless they changed something or found additional resources. Against this background, Caldwell's situation stood out with uncomfortable clarity. He had burned significantly less wood. His supply remained ample. The reason was no longer mysterious, even if its implications were not yet fully understood. Dry fuel burned hotter and longer, A house shielded from direct exposure lost heat more slowly. These were facts now demonstrated by experience rather than theory. Inspection of Caldwell's hangar revealed further advantages. The outer shell showed where the storm had struck hardest, boards scoured by ice and wind, but these were superficial marks. The structure had done its work by absorbing damage meant for the house within. Repairs, if needed, would be simple and inexpensive, involving replaceable exterior elements rather than critical structural components. The inner house, by contrast, appeared preserved, as though time itself had been slowed within its boundaries. As days passed, discussions grew more candid. Builders who had once dismissed the hangar as wasteful now examined its details closely. They traced airflow paths with their hands, felt temperature differences, and noted how moisture behaved inside the structure. Some began to recognize parallels with barns and sheds they had built for animals or equipment, structures designed to moderate conditions rather than exclude them entirely. The difference lay in applying those principles to the house itself. Numbers mattered in this reckoning. When estimates were made of wood consumption over the storm period, Caldwell's usage proved dramatically lower. Extended across an entire winter, the savings were substantial. In a place where firewood represented both labor and security, reducing consumption by even a quarter meant weeks of extra safety. Reducing it by nearly half altered the balance entirely. Fuel saved could be turned to other needs or simply held in reserve against uncertainty. There were other considerations as well. Health concerns, often accepted as unavoidable, began to be reconsidered. Smoke exposure during the storm had been severe in many homes, aggravating lungs and leaving lingering coughs. In Caldwell's house, cleaner combustion had kept the air clear. Warmth had been consistent, reducing strain on bodies already taxed by cold and labor. These effects were harder to quantify, but no less real. By late winter, the settlement had entered a period of reflection. Repairs continued, but so did conversations about building practices long taken for granted. The hangar around Caldwell's house no longer seemed strange. It seemed instructive. What had once been viewed as excess now appeared as foresight, an investment that paid dividends precisely when conditions were worst. Caldwell did not claim credit or argue his case. He allowed the structure to speak for itself. When asked, he answered questions plainly, explaining what he had done and why without embellishment. He emphasized that the hangar was not about adding warmth directly, but about protecting dryness and slowing loss. He described it as a way of letting the environment do less harm, rather than forcing the house to resist more. As winter edged toward its end, the effects of the storm continued to ripple outward. Plans were adjusted. Some families began setting aside lumber for future projects. Others made sketches or measurements, experimenting with the idea of surrounding their own homes with protective shells. What had begun as an unusual construction had become a reference point, a standard against which other approaches were measured. The reckoning was not dramatic, but it was decisive. The storm had provided evidence that could not be argued away. In its aftermath, the settlement stood changed, not just by snow and ice, but by a new understanding of how survival might be made less costly, less fragile, and more certain in the winters yet to come. By the time the snow began to recede from the edges of the forest and the first dark lines of earth reappeared along the south-facing slopes, the settlement had entered a quiet transition. Winter was not yet finished, but its authority had weakened. Days lengthened almost imperceptibly, and the light carried a different quality, less brittle, more forgiving. With that change came a shift in how people spoke about the months just endured. What had once been described as hardship alone was now discussed in terms of lessons learned, comparisons made, and choices reconsidered. Caldwell's wooden hangar, once regarded as an eccentric indulgence, had become a reference point. It stood unchanged as the outer snowbanks slowly collapsed and melted away, revealing the full outline of its structure again. The house within remained largely unseen from a distance, concealed as it always had been, but the idea it embodied had begun to circulate far beyond the boundaries of his property. People spoke of it not with mockery, but with a cautious respect that deepened as spring approached. The first to act were those whose trades made them receptive to structural reasoning. Builders and carpenters, already accustomed to thinking in terms of load, airflow, and material behavior, began to adapt the concept in small ways. Some extended roofs farther from their walls. Others added partial outer frames to shield vulnerable sides of their houses from prevailing winds. A few went further, sketching full enclosures modeled loosely on Caldwell's hangar, adjusting dimensions to suit their own needs and resources. These early adaptations varied widely. Some were crude, little more than oversized sheds pressed close to existing homes. Others showed greater refinement, incorporating better drainage, more deliberate ventilation, and multi-purpose storage. Not all were successful. Mistakes were made, gaps placed incorrectly, airflow restricted where it should have been allowed. Yet even these imperfect attempts demonstrated something important. The principle itself was sound. Even partial implementation yielded measurable benefits. As word spread beyond the immediate settlement, the idea began to travel along familiar routes of communication. Loggers carried it to neighboring camps. Farmers mentioned it at markets farther south. Relatives visiting from other regions returned home with descriptions of houses sheltered within wooden shells, of firewood kept dry through the worst of winter, of homes that did not fight the cold so much as step aside from it. The concept found especially fertile ground among those accustomed to harsh climates and limited resources, where efficiency was not an abstract goal, but a daily necessity. Over the next few years, variations of the hangar house began to appear across the region. Some were large and barn-like, enclosing not only homes but workspaces and storage areas. Others were more compact, scaled tightly to the house they protected. In farming communities, the outer shell often served multiple purposes, housing equipment, feed, and animals while shielding the dwelling itself. In forested areas, the space became a workshop and fuel store, centralizing winter labor under a single protective roof. What united these variations was not their appearance, which differed greatly, but their function. Each created a buffer between living space and environment. Each managed moisture deliberately. Each slowed the exchange of heat without sealing it entirely. Builders who adopted the approach found that their structures aged differently. Logs remained sound longer. Foundations showed fewer signs of frost damage. Repairs became less frequent and less severe. Over time, the economic implications became clear. Reduced fuel consumption and lower maintenance costs combined to offset the additional labor and materials required to build the outer shell. Health outcomes shifted as well, though these changes were discussed more quietly. Homes that stayed warmer with cleaner burning fires produced less smoke. Air inside remained clearer. Winters passed with fewer lingering illnesses, fewer weeks of weakness following storms. These effects were difficult to measure precisely, but they were felt. Families noticed them in the resilience of their routines, in the way children recovered more quickly from cold days, in the reduced strain of constant vigilance against freezing. Caldwell observed these developments with a mixture of satisfaction and detachment. He did not claim authorship of a new method. When asked about the spread of the idea, he described it as an application of old knowledge to a different problem. He spoke of shipyards and sheds, of protecting materials by controlling exposure rather than eliminating it. To him, the hangar was not an invention so much as a reminder, a translation of principles learned in one environment into another that demanded them just as urgently. As the years passed, the hangar around his house became an unremarkable feature of the landscape, accepted rather than questioned. Children who grew up seeing it never thought of it as strange. To them, a house sheltered within a larger structure was simply one way of building, appropriate to a place where winter shaped every aspect of life. The novelty faded, replaced by familiarity and, eventually, by expectation. New houses were planned with outer shells from the beginning, rather than added later. Builders refined proportions, balancing airflow and protection more precisely. Some incorporated removable panels to adjust ventilation seasonally. Others experimented with different materials, adapting the concept as milling techniques improved and supplies became more accessible. The core idea remained unchanged, even as its expression evolved. Long after the storm that had brought the reckoning, its influence persisted. It had done more than test endurance. It had forced a comparison between habit and outcome, between what was assumed to work and what actually did. The hangar house stood at the center of that comparison, not as a monument, but as a living example. It demonstrated that efficiency could come from restraint, that durability could come from cooperation with natural forces rather than opposition. In time, the approach found echoes beyond the region. Architectural journals and agricultural bulletins began to mention enclosed dwellings and ventilated outer shells as practical solutions for cold climates. The language grew more technical, the explanations more formal, but the essence remained the same. Air was allowed to move, moisture was given paths to escape. Structures were protected by layers that could be repaired or replaced without compromising what lay within. Caldwell lived to see these changes take root, though he never sought recognition for them. His house remained as it had been, quietly doing its work year after year. When repairs were needed, they were made to the outer shell, leaving the inner house largely untouched. Seasons passed. Winters came and went. The hangar bore the marks of time, weathered and reshaped by exposure, while the dwelling it sheltered remained remarkably constant. Eventually, what had once been an oddity became tradition. New generations accepted the practice without knowing its origins, guided by results rather than stories. The lesson embedded in the structure endured precisely because it did not rely on novelty. It relied on understanding. It acknowledged that survival in a harsh environment did not require constant struggle, only thoughtful design. In the end, the significance of Caldwell's hangar was not that it changed how houses looked, but that it changed how people thought about the space around them. It reframed emptiness as function, air as material, and protection as something achieved through balance rather than brute force. The wooden shell around a modest house became a quiet argument for humility before nature, for learning rather than resisting, and for building not just to endure a single winter, but to last through many. If you enjoyed this story and the ideas behind it, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. More stories like this are coming, stories about forgotten knowledge, simple ideas, and practical wisdom that still matters today. Check out the other videos on the channel to continue exploring how people in the past solved problems we still face now. And if you know someone who would appreciate this kind of story, share this video with them. It really helps the channel grow and reach more people. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.